What's going on, YouTube? One of the questions I get quite a bit is how Frank is as low as it is on a Crown Vic front end and still maintains good suspension geometry. And a lot of people have gotten the answer, the Framesy. So I have an opportunity here. I've got a 1970 really clean example of a 1970 Ranger XLT for a good friend. He wants a Framesy, so we're going to talk about what's going to go into that. I'm going to walk us through it. This is not going to be a very long video, but it's going to be pretty informative. So first things first, the Crown Vic Swap has everything's been drilled for the Crown Vic Swap. So I got my front bolts, my rear bolts, and my centering pin drilled. Now, one thing to talk about is some people go off the front hole, some people go off the back hole. A lot of people go 3/4 off of center of the front hole. And that's how I do them most of the time. I've had people request to go off the front hole. If you go off the front hole, you probably have a better chance of running a Mustang 5-speed transmission out of either a Fox or a SN95 or a New Edge, and the shifter not getting to the bench seat. But one of the things that comes with that is these absolutely beautiful trailing arm mounts from Kyle Howard at Outcast. AutoWorks, these work great, but when you move that hole back 3/4 of an inch, you're going to get a little bit into the edge of the cab mount. You can see where it kind of contours and kicks out. So normally what I do is I just use a cut-off disc and just cut back through there enough and then finish it with a file and then clean it all up. But since we want a Framesy, we got to take the cab mount off. While we're here, I'm going to talk about 9 times out of 10 remove this transmission cross member. Reason being is there's no reason to keep these trailing arm mounts. They do hold that cross member, but other than that, you don't need all this. So I mean, you could cut it and clean it up if you're going to run, you know, maybe a stock carb, stock style trans. But 9 times out of 10, you're going to go with the Stifler's cross member. For your trans, you're going to go with something else. And once the Crown Vic clamps here, and I weld a 2-inch OD up front to stiffen the front, haven't had any issues. So that's what we're gonna do. We're gonna zap all these rivets off, get the cab mount off, and then we're gonna measure for our cuts to make sure we have a nice, straight, clean Framesy. Let's get after it. Okay, we've got all those things removed. Cab mounts are gone, cross member's gone. I've got the Crown Vic front end sitting back under this. Reason being is you wanna get your trailing arm mount if you're not using the Outcast, and if you're using, you know, some you made or some you got from Brian over at BYC. Either way, you want to see that you're going to clear where your cut is. I'll go ahead and tell you. So these 4 holes are where your cab mount was mounted, and so I like to use this hole right. It's not centered between them, but it's a good spot. You know, it should be consistent on each side. That way you won't have like staggered cuts on each side. But it also, you know, if you come back here, you get a lot of room if you need to maintenance this control arm, take the nut off, whatever. Whereas you get too close to it, you lock yourself in. So a couple of things I like to do before I get into the Zing. Everybody's shop should have a level and a framing square. The top part of the frame rail here where the Crown Vic bolts in is flat. And so you can trust that. It's I think, if I remember, it's level with the flat surface where of the frame where the bed mounts. So I like to get that leveled, and then I like to take my framing square and flush that up on the top there. Get it centered over that hole, and we get a nice clean cut. And when you level the frame out, when you're making these marks and these cuts, it doesn't mess with you in terms of looking at it going, that's not straight. So you really want a straight cut, and I'll tell you why. If you had an angled cut that leaned forward and you cut it and it was just, I mean, if it was 1 degree off, when you slide this up, the frame is going to grow. And if it's 1 or 2 degrees backwards and you slide up, the frame's going to shrink. So, you know, you want to kind of keep it in factory tolerances as much as possible. So you can see we don't have a frame machine here. I used to have a miniature one that sat under the front, but quite frankly, hot rodders for decades have been sectioning the fronts of cars and doing a really good job with it. And with old school approaches and methods, you can get there and not cause yourself the pain of having a frame machine. So next up, I'm going to get this cleaned up, mark where the cuts are going to go. You do the same thing on the front. You'd want to keep in mind that a lot of people use this as the front hole for the sway bar and then measure back for the second hole. It's a little far forward from where it should be, but it does work. So we're going to go about 2 inches in front of this for the front cut. And I'll walk you through that too. Okay, so I failed you a little bit because I'm not doing time lapses on this one, or I haven't been. I might do one now. So I forgot to capture the first cut. But the next step would have been to, I like to make 2 marks so that when you slide the frame up, you're going to line up this side of the bottom mark with this side of the top mark. And that's really not to ensure any straightness or anything, but it's just to make sure that we have the same distance, because you're basically cutting the front frame horns off, moving them down, and cutting the back half of the frame here and moving it down so this sets up. And so it's really just make sure you got the same cut front to back. So where I failed is I've already done the front. So you can see where I sectioned this piece of the frame out and I sectioned this piece of the frame out. The cut is back through here. Took the same approach there, and that's how I'll know front to back I have the same Z. So I've got the structural pipe welded in. I'm going to take the bumper off because it's heavy, and so when I cut this I can take probably 50 pounds off the front, so we can get that jigged up. So with that, we'll move on to the next part, which is moving to the rear cut. It's going pretty well. Catch you in a sec. Okay, so I've made the cuts on both sides except for the top flange. Like to tack a brace to the top on one side and a bottom on the other. You could do one top and bottom on each side, would probably make it easier, but at least I have a reference point, because you can see on that cut the bottom of this one on the back side of the frame kicked out a little bit. So the good thing is I know that the bottom of this one is going to be true and the top of this one is going to be true, so I can work that frame to get it square. But I just was out of angle to do that like I normally would have been having to use it. So got the cuts done except for the top, so I'm about to make the top cut. I've got the frame braced so that it doesn't just fall when it happens. So we'll make that cut, and then I'll slide this up and I will line this line up with that line, tack it up, and then we'll catch back up to you. Okay, so what I was doing there was just checking the level and squareness of everything in front of the cut. So what you can do is where I've got my braces tacked, that one's welded in, everything's level, so we don't have any wonky twisted sections of the frame here. But you can check the squareness of a frame by finding factory mounting points, and so I just checked from that one across to this back one, and the same on the other side. And we are within a 1/16 of an inch, which is when I measured it before, was within a 1/16. So we're good to go. You can see where I took that mark, both sides. So what we'll do now is we'll weld this up, and we will successfully have Z'd the frame. Now again, don't forget I've already done the front. So if you do this on the back, you have to do it on the front, otherwise the whole front core support, sheet metal, everything on it's going to be 2 inches higher. So you got to basically lower the front frame horns down 2 inches, and you're lowering the back of the frame. Essentially you're lifting up, setting the movable parts of the chassis in the front up in the chassis 2 inches. So I'm not going to cover how to French things in. That's kind of where we all have our own creative differences. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get this fully welded out. We'll get it boxed in, we'll get the Crown Vic back under it, and then I'll show you what we'll need to do to the cab mounts to make sure that all lines up well. Okay, so frame's been all boxed in, Crown Vic stuff's done, the frames have been boxed in and inside and out. See your fish plated inside, there's a 4x4 inch fish plate in there, triangular fish plate in the front. So, you know, this frame is quite a bit more rigid than it was coming off the assembly line in 70. But now it's time to put the cab mounts back on. So again, kind of like finishing out the Z, you know, I walked through how to cut it and how to slide it and measure it and get it going. This part's kind of like that way too, in the sense of, you know, I'm not going to walk you through how to make this pretty. I'm just going to walk you through how to make sure it's straight, because, you know, that's what makes us unique, is we all do things a little differently. So this is the existing top hole that went here, and these are the cab mount holes from the front side. So what I did is I used the same measuring tool I used to make my marks earlier, and you can kind of see it. I've got marks made, so I'm going to line that hole up there. I'm going to find that center punch mark, and that is essentially the cab mount placement. Now you would want to trim it so it doesn't hang down, and what I like to do is leave a little bit of a bevel. It's kind of hard to see. I still need to clean it up so it'll sit flush. Leave a little bit of a bevel so we can get good burn in there, because I'm not going to bolt these on. I'm going to clean them up and weld them on. So next shot's going to be everything completed, fully assembled, with a little bit of satin black on it, with the Vic front end back under it. Okay, we got everything back together. Final assembly on the Vic Swap, the Frame Z. See all the boxing and dimple dies. If you don't like dimple dies, just get out. They look good. One of the things I want to point out is when you do your taper, so you can see the fish plate, so you know the cut's back here. When you do the taper, you really don't want to go more than 6.5 to 7 inches back into the lower section of the frame. That way you don't get into the cab floor. So this is a perfect angle on the frame. Got your e-brake cable in there. Not getting into the floor at all. But yeah, looking good, looking low. Got to do something about that rear real quick, which is great because we've got some help. We're going to do a time lapse.